Welcome. It is I, Zakai. I love doing this. Welcome to Z Podcast. Today we're going to be going into some really interesting thesis work. We're returning to the thesis defense that I did not too long ago. Sorry for the hiatus. The finals week and a few other things had caught me off track, but I have quite a few things planned for this channel and the podcast series that I hope that you will enjoy. One is very much related to the actual thesis. I just want to dive right back into this. The question that we're going to be uncovering in this section of the thesis defense is usage of metaphor, more comedic relief, the rule of three, repetition legitimizes, thank you, Adam Neely, and just how to guide people through actually learning a complex process within 15 minutes. Oh, and I have this camera now. Anyway, I'll pause just as usual, and just let's get into it.
Is a circular process that starts from the top. And the way that I would like to describe this is think about cooking. Everyone cooks or knows about cooking, right? When you cook, you start with ingredients. That is the memory that you have. And those ingredients you use and you make some sort of recipe, follow a recipe or make something on your own. That process of cooking is the configuration. And then over time, when you are finished and you eat it, it changes how you have thought of those ingredients, right? And even though you might use the same ingredients over and over, because you do things slightly differently every single time, it refigures your expectation of the future. And if you're feeding people, they're probably going to also be like, wow, that garlic tasted a lot different this time.
So something that I used somewhat often, but I wish that I did more, was this cooking analogy, because the cooking analogy, magnifique, very, very good. This is developing a personal connection to my work because of the nature of this field, and just the nature of temporal consciousness in general being a complex, more academic related subject. I think that it was necessary to allude to something that everyone could understand. In this case, it would be cooking. And for me, that's what kind of related to my own life, and I thought that it would be a perfect way to relate to everyone else's. I use this in a very strategic way to not only manifest the general concept, but apply it to cultures. However, I didn't do it super well. I would say that if I had to do this again, something I would really hone in on is using that cooking analogy every single time a culture is mentioned in my case studies. But nevertheless, process of emphasis through analogy, I think really solidified for a lot of people when I spoke to them after the defense that it was something that they could understand.
What did you do? And that goes back into their memory. Improvisers do the same thing. They memorize a bunch of scales or licks, idioms, etc., or whatever is appropriate in their culture, and then configure that live and make something up in the moment using what they already know. And then that transforms how they perceive what they already knew, as well as the audience around them, they get a new understanding. So this process goes cyclical, and improvisers are very conscious of all three of these stages at the same time. They're very much aware of their memory. They're very much aware of the present moment and playing something, but they also have a structure that they have to follow or can make up a structure that they have to follow. All of these things create a level of expectation for the future. So, my research. What does this deal with? Well, as I said before, applying this framework to other cultures. Jerstedt applied this to jazz. He proved that this cyclical framework works in jazz. But my question is, and in his future research, he described maybe applying that to other music or other communications or art. So I'm basically answering the question, is the non-Western tradition still going to fit within this framework with minor tweaking?
Something that I really liked about just this slide in general is that you could read a little bit of the secondaries of the questions, but I kind of flowed through the general process. And I love that I didn't look at the slide too much, but really illustrated the main problem as well as the vestiges of, or I guess the precursors, I should say, the precursors that led to these questions, which was Jerstedt's research in his conclusion, future research. I don't know, I just really enjoyed the way that this was concise and I think well put. I don't think I go much longer after this, hopefully.
So,
Also, while I mention this, I say so like every single time that I transition. And now that I've told you this, you're going to remember it every single time that you watch through any of these videos or my thesis defense. Maybe I do it when I'm presenting in general. I need to work on that. That is too much work, Sakai. We're going off.
to finalize the kind of ingredients that I'm using, right? It is the scope and limitation that I want to make sure I acknowledge. I only speak English. I'm learning Portuguese, but I'm only speaking English. So I need to only read those kinds of accessible things. And then there's a level of documentation issue with indigenous culture. So I can't go into those fields, but I'm looking for the most popular cultural improvisation within each region. And then again, for the documentation reasons, post 1950s is all my focus because earlier than that, there's not a lot of great documentation. So when it comes to actually developing the method, it's going to be coding. To explain all of this simply, this is simply just coding. I'm going to look at documents from practitioners and improvisers. I'm going to read through them and see what they say about their experience. And then if their experience matches this idea of memory, attention, expectation, then I will say, oh, okay, you see some evidence of this process. And if I get a consensus with large documentation, which I will show that I have, we can say that confidently these improvisations in other cultures practice that methodology. So let's start with the first case study, Arabic. So in Arabic music, something that's really interesting is compared to regular theory of the West, the maqam system that they use is in what you call tuning, like they have a different level of tuning, which means that these 12 keys I have, right, there's notes in between that are even more precise than the 12 that I have right now, which makes it a lot more complex and complicated, right? But then also, the maqam system says that a scale can usually only have an associated melody within that scale. So those keys that I just played, you can only play them in a certain order for that particular scale. Imagine how complicated that can get really quickly. So there's a level of constraints there, but they still improvise.
So I struggled a little bit to remember microtonal. I don't know why I couldn't remember microtonal, but must have been like a little bit of nerves or just a mind blank. But I think that that led me to actually demonstrating, and I'll repeat it as many times as I need to. Demonstrating anything is going to connect with the audience a lot more and prove and develop a point that's more tangible than just, my wild gesticulations and verbosity. It's really important to me to do those kinds of things. It's kind of spontaneous because I really didn't plan on doing that. But to actually, think in the moment, I'm like failing to come up with the words. So let me just demonstrate the word. It shouldn't even be that way. It should be just demonstrating right there. It should be planned in like my presentation to innovate as much as I can with my keyboard or whatever instrument I'm using. And this can apply to any kind of creative work that you're doing, especially when it comes to music, but in general, the creative arts, as we know. Anyway,
We're going to talk about how. Their way of improvising usually is a solo, and that moves them into what's called modal ecstasy. Their context and how they develop improvisation, what determines their success, is becoming one with the music. It is an ecstatic awakening. That's how they describe it. It's something spiritual within that aligns with the music. And we're going to find out why one of the reasons I chose this case was that there's a problem with that decision making that I highlighted earlier about improvisation. Something's different here. And it's going to dissolve the boundary between the performer and the audience. So just quickly, so I can demonstrate this process and you don't, have no idea what I might be talking about. Here's a little clip of Racy, who is actually, I used a lot of his work to actually build evidence. He's a really great Arabic improviser, musician, and composer.
so I won't play this part, but I wanted to like at least demonstrate a little bit something to the audience, and this was planned, right? To show a video of an actual expert performing. This was actually recommended by my supervisor, and I had thought about it, but when he recommended it, I'm like, okay, let's actually do that. And I thought that it was a pretty good way of, demonstrating not only the microtones, but also just how someone starts playing and composing and performing in somewhat of an improvisatory way. Obviously, we didn't do like an in-depth analysis of this, but nonetheless, like it's still apparent, right?
They use the Makam mastery and that accumulated knowledge. So just like we would learn scales in Western music, they have their scales. They have their ways of constructing different melodies. And in the Makam case, they have more, constriction, as I demonstrated. There's a little layer of knowing where to just start and where to end. So there's, a tighter constraint. Unlike jazz, there is a level of development that is beyond just the individual. You have to, for a successful performance, improvise and be focused on the crowd. You notice I wasn't really looking at you guys when I was playing, but in their case, they have to be watching. They're watching for your facial expressions, they're watching for the gestures, and this audience isn't just, a layman audience like ourselves, right? They have an expert audience, which means they know about the Makam system, they know about the general metaphors and idioms used. They're very much aware, and they give verbal and gestural feedback. So they have a lot of gesticulation, and that's part of like the success of reaching the Torah, which is that ecstatic feeling.
Something else to highlight is I alluded to in the overview that there's going to be a dissolvement between the individual and the audience. And I think that this is a really good rhetorical technique of, giving something to later, tie in. So I'm preparing you for something. Excuse me. Anyway.
But similarly to jazz, there is this element of you can only be taught so much. After you learn the Makam and the general, idioms and structures, you have to learn how to get to that height, that ecstatic level, that spiritual level. Just like in jazz, when people tell you, you have to learn how to play with your instrument and speak with your instrument, right? When they use terms like that, you're like, what do you mean? Like, how do you actually speak with the instrument? Like, it's not my voice, but you have to figure that out for yourself. And that's the aspect that's similar to jazz. So when it comes to configuration, this is again the aspect of attentively improvising. So we just talked about their ingredients, and now we're talking about them cooking. So how do they cook? Well, I consider the audience to be me and myself to be the audience. That's a quote from a very famous practitioner. And this shows that there's a dissolving between you guys and myself to a level where we both reach the same emotional and spiritual height. This is very important, again, in Arabic music. This synthesis is why I challenge the idea of decision-making. If we are trying to improvise, because now it's a we thing, right? How can I make a decision? It's not like that in Arabic music. There has to be a gathering together of all these inputs and outputs by the performer, of you guys, myself, the emotional heights, the levels together. And all of that means it's not just a simple decision. It has to be a synthesization, a continuous alignment of a bunch of parameters to create something. So their cooking is like them watching the oven and the stove and the microwave, and you're also making sure that the kids are happy and et cetera. Like all that's part of the cooking process now. So they have a lot more complicated levels, in improvisation than we just know in, our typical jazz world.
So I loved, again, using the metaphor analogy here and relating it to the culture. In this case, I did it pretty well. I wish I did it a little bit earlier with prefiguration and configuration, but nonetheless, I think that it kind of landed in particular to make the point known. Again, that repetition continues to solidify the idea in people's minds.
There's much more. And that's why I think that there's a terminological failure. We can't use decision-making, we have to use real-time synthesis. So refiguration, again, is the act of consuming the food. Now the performance is done, or we are like listening to the performance live. How is this affecting our psyche? Well, just like in jazz, it refigures your memory, refigures how you use the Makam, the different performances. And in addition to you, the audience gets refigured because they're so important, right? Like, in jazz, it would have the same feeling, but because they are an expert audience, their minds are much more refigured now because you're conducting with them the improvisation.
Something to note here is that I should have specified something in detail, which is the expert audience gets more refigured than a layman audience that doesn't fully understand to reach the ability to even start refiguring their mind because of the level of information that's changing differs in ability, but that's neither here nor there.
There's a tarif, which means heritage in Arabic. This means that there's people that are known, just like maybe Dizzy Gillespie or Bill Evans, that have a notoriety of defining the improvisation in Arabic music. So there's as much depth. This is why I think that temporal consciousness, this prefiguration, configuration, refiguration, applies to Arabic music. And you can see that pretty clearly with this evidence. But there must be an adjustment, right, of that decision making versus synthesis. Now, to gamelan. You have a collective distributed agency. So in gamelan music, they're generally an ensemble, right? There's a group of people actually improvising. And this happens in Indonesia. And it's usually for sacred performances or something along those lines, special occasions. And they have a collective understanding. And I'm going to play a video clip that I think is really, really cool. The coordination is their constraint. Now we would think, okay, the maqam, already you have the scale and then the melody, they have to be super intertwined. Could anything be worse? Oh, yes, gamelan has a constraint system so tight that it challenges the very notion of improvisation itself. People have written literal papers asking, is gamelan improvisation? Like that was literally a title of the paper. So there's a level of, there was a level of confusion whether or not this is improvisation. And I will show how it is improvisation, and in addition, the constraints used. They use skeletal melodies, which are these frameworks, and they have dozens and dozens of patterns that they memorize, and then they decide which pattern to use. And different subcultures in gamelan specifically use tighter constraints to those patterns. Maybe you could do pattern 1 and then pattern 3 and then pattern 2. But in some cases, you can only do that. But maybe you do pattern 1, pattern 3, pattern 4. So there is some even tighter things within the subculture, which again challenges that idea of improvisation. So how do they improvise? Well, let's watch a little bit of them improvising.
So while this video plays, I think what is really nice about the overview section is I become a little bit more gesturing, but also like there is a level of comedy to what I'm doing. I'm kind of exaggerating. The only critique that I have about that section is using the word worse to describe what gamelan is. I should have said something like tighter, something that's connotatively different, something that is very important when just going about your life in the world in this day and age of media being so connected and out there that you really have to moderate how you say things because I don't view it as like a worse thing, but because I said that, it does refigure people's minds to adjust to gamelan itself as well as my perception of gamelan, what they see as my perception. So being very careful about how I'm placing those words would be critical to a better presentation here.
When I watched this, I was impressed. Why was I impressed? Because it sounded like there was only one, percussive instrument there. What was, huh? So I had to really think about this and look through the literature a lot more because I was like, this is even challenging my idea, and I'm pretty open to the idea that this could be improvisation. So let's see how they actually do that. So part of their memory, again, their ingredients, is that structural and pattern vocabulary. And it's also this idea of floating along. It's like if I was playing, just a very, very simple melody on the keyboard, and you all had keyboards in front of you, and you guys just had to figure out with me how I'm actually playing that. I'm not telling you, but you're figuring out with me. And that's their process of building that memory box. So it is kind of configuration and prefiguration at the same time, which I found really, really interesting.
I'm conflating structural roles with the negle. One thing I will and should also mention with the global and cultural thing is probably should learn how to pronounce these words well and right and effectively. Nonetheless, there is a type of passive instrumentalists that will accompany collectives in this improvisational culture, and they simply float along with them. Like they literally just learn as they go, kind of feeling the vibes. Their understanding of the patterns and the structure and the rhythm is comparatively a lot less than per se experts, but they still can play with them, especially because of the repetitive nature of Javanese and Balinese improvisation.
A quote from one of the practitioners talks about experience as a teacher. So again, that idea of the floating knowledge and feeling the movement. There's a constraint spectrum. So the aspect that I talked about of how some patterns are allowed and there's flexibility, but in some subcultures, they're very, very much more specific. But what differs in their actual improvisation is the configuration. How do they actually improvise? Well, this ensemble doesn't have freedom to just do whatever they want. Similarly in jazz, which is a lot more egalitarian, where they have more individualized choice. They are collective. They have a hierarchy that is even more distributed than just regular president, et cetera. It's more of, I like using the halocracy, I think it's called, because I remember your class, where it's like different circles of different skills are allotted to a variety of different people. There's a person who controls the temporal authority, that structural time, and then other people that control the melodic suggestion and how they develop, and others that can keep the rhythm and the stability. And they have this whole intricate process between them. You would have never thought by watching that video that there was all of that going on, but there is. It's incredible. It's like if you're cooking and you have all of your kids cooking with you, and your partner, et cetera, and they're all doing different things, but it's like even more systemized. It's like, okay, you need to crack the egg. Okay, you need to add the flour. Okay, it's a very process that's integrated, but they do it so well that you think it's one instrument. Incredible.
That you think it's one person, but nonetheless, I think that this again was a good execution, somewhat good execution of pulling that analogy in. But the prefiguration, configuration, refiguration aspect, I think, is super important to repeat a little bit more with the analogy and integrate it more with the analogy, because something was missing, in my opinion, there. We have just a little bit left of this little segment.
Now, how do they refigure? There's a 3-level transformation. So they're having this process, and over time, they're learning individually how to use those patterns effectively, and they evolve. You can see here that someone was tracked for 21 years, and they showed that the stability of their patterns was there, but how they preference and prefer the patterns changes over time. Also, there's a competence of fluency within the actual field. So people understand more how to be aligned within the ensemble and get that fluency together. And then there's also a communal evolution, because of the sacredness, there is an element of, okay, we're about to watch gameland performance, and it redefines what the culture believes. So there's an ability to accumulate configuration through the actual execution. It's not just them tracking everything. It's not a conscious decision. It becomes an unconscious thing. And that's why I believe that there's evidence to show that gameland uses this temporal consciousness. There is these organic metaphors as well. I didn't cover too much of that because, trust me, just read the section on gameland. You'll find out that there's a lot of organic aspects and metaphors used within gameland that refine this process for them. And that shows the difference between the spiritual and the static, and then the jazz, which is the narrative conversational. So they all use different metaphors, but we're finding evidence that they're doing the same thing. And this is why I think that gameland practices not only improvisation, but the actual temporal consciousness. So I have a gift for everyone here. This is a...
So I'm going to stop it right here, but I gave out some pamphlets that show a table that categorizes everything in each culture in the prefiguration, refiguration, configuration. Great little chart, little tidbit. I think it was a little bit too small, but nonetheless, I tried. Again, that was to interject something into the presentation, instead of me just yapping the whole entire time, wanted to make something a bit more interactive. Along with actually playing something, I passed on something. But I want to stop here because I think that this, with me in the corner right there, it demonstrates how I was able to pull people in and articulate something that's highly complex in a somewhat easy to understand way. Obviously, I think that if you spend months, years studying this, there's no comparison to just a simple presentation on it. But trying to break it down as much as possible, which I had to really concisely do from, 120 pages now to this. I think I did really well in trying to do that. So to take away what I think you can use as transferable skills through this process is having something that's memorable with the three-pronged repetition, the rule of three, the prefiguration, configuration, refiguration. Don't just state it and then lose it throughout. Make sure that it's constantly there so that people keep hearing it and are kind of forced to understand. I think using analogies, again, that are personal is a great way to demonstrate whatever your framework understanding, whatever the concept is that you're trying to get people to learn. If you can create a one-to-one or a very similar analogy that people do often, that can really solidify someone's understanding of whatever they're learning. And as long as you're keeping both the framework and the analogy constant, as I tried to do throughout each of the case studies and in the beginning while describing the overall framework, you can really effectively convey anything. And I think that this was really important to just pull away from. I also think that injecting comedy is a wonderful thing. Um, I've repeated it before, but I think it's just a great thing to do. And you should always be willing to be a little bit extra. I think that that's something that presenters do miss often, especially what I see around at university. I wish that people were just a little bit more energetic and slightly over the top, not too much, but slightly over the top, where you're allowed to break those rules, um, to go into the aesthetic. Um, but yeah, I think overall I did a pretty good job in this section. The next few parts is just the results and teaching, but that's what's going to lead me to a new series. So I'd like to do a final episode from this thesis defense, going through how I answered some of the questions and improvise throughout that. And it's going to be a little bit of a shorter video where I just talk through how I prepared myself, if my answers were good or not, things of that nature. Then I wanted to start a new series that deals with learning improvisation. I want to tackle the challenge of taking my thesis and all of the applicatory stuff that I theorized and trying to create into a medium format type content that is much more dense, I think, than what is usually seen here in MZ podcast. But nonetheless, I think it's going to be fun. It's going to be hopefully 2 seasons, maybe 3, and each of these seasons is going to describe, develop, and create an understanding for a viewer that is a musician, for those who are looking to improvise or kind of know how to improvise but are looking for more rigor and academic perspective, creators who are interested in cross-pollinating this kind of idea because temporal consciousness is everywhere, to pull the frameworks into, improv groups, comedy tropes, live streams. It could be anything. There is a lot of ways to actually pull this understanding into other fields and use that more. And also for people who are interested in teaching this, I'm going to try and see how far this paper will take me. I've gotten a lot of great feedback and a lot of interesting pushes to get me to very interesting places. That's been very exciting to hear. But I am looking for something that's, more holistic and down to earth, and also to challenge myself. And I want you to learn with me as I kind of go through this process of starting to see how I can effectively teach this and hopefully spread the word to others about this really interesting perspective on improvisation. And so I'm going to be starting this series hopefully very, very soon. I think I'm going to start recording probably next week and get quite a few episodes together and start scheduling them out. And hopefully that will evolve into something new. And I hope that you join along with me, even if you're not a musician, just to see the process. I hope to do more graphics and fun stuff and be a little bit more curated and edited than the current podcast series. But don't worry, deep dives and media autopsies will still be around and consistent. I hope to do this for the next few months pretty well, and stay on top of this channel because this is fun and it's giving me a great way of seeing myself do things and correcting myself and finding intrigue. Of course, I'm metacognitioning my own podcast. But anyway, thank you for your time. I'm really happy that you're here. Hopefully, you'll watch the final episodes, and I'll see you then. Toodaloo.